Okay, we're gonna wait just a minute or two to let people in from the waiting room. Again, it's always nice to see people streaming in. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I am Jenny Sartori, and I am the editor of the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women at the Jewish Women's Archive, as well as the Chief Communications Officer. I know many of you are used to seeing Judith Rosenbaum here, but she's not able to be here, so I'm filling in for her. I am so pleased to be with you today for the last of our June book talks. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who's with us in the room, and that is where you can also add your questions, and we will bring them in later in the program. A few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We're a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. We believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps to create a better world, and the book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I hope you'll check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. So a few quick things before we jump into tonight's wonderful program. This summer, we're doing a short survey about our virtual programming to help us as we plan our future programs. So whether you are a longtime participant with us since we started in March of 2024 or new to us, we'd love to hear from you. So please see the link in the chat. My colleague is going to drop that into the chat for you, and it will also be in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow with the link to the recording. Second, although we are only midway through the calendar year, at JWA, we are fast approaching the end of our fiscal year, which is June 30th. We rely on the generosity of our community to keep our work going. If you have already donated to JWA, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And if you haven't and are able to help us continue to bring us programs like this, we're grateful to your support. You can donate at jwa.org/donate. That link is also in the chat, and it will also be in tomorrow's follow-up email. And one quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the CC button, closed captioning button on the bottom where it says show captions. We can't do that for you. You have to do that for yourself. Okay, so I am so delighted to introduce our two featured speakers for the evening. First, I will introduce Frances Malino. Fran is the Sophia Moses Robeson Professor Emerita of Jewish Studies and History at Wellesley College. She's the author of The Sephardic Jews of Bordeaux, Assimilation and Emancipation in Revolutionary and Napoleonic France, published in 1978, and A Jew in the French Revolution, The Life of Zalkand Horwitz, published in 1996. And she is also co-editor of a number of books, Essays in Modern Jewish History, A Tribute to Ben Halpern, The Jews in Modern France, Profiles in Diversity, Jews in a Changing Europe, and Voices of the Diaspora, Jewish Women Writing in the New Europe. Her translation with Yaëlle of the novel Mazaltob, which we'll be discussing tonight, appeared this spring. Fran is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including being named Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Palmes Académiques by the French Ministry of Education in 2012. She is also a co-founder and current president of Digital Heritage Mapping, whose flagship initiative is the Diarna Geo Museum of North African and Middle Eastern Jewish Life, which is truly fascinating. So check it out if you haven't, and we can put the link to that in the chat as well. And I have to say, it gives me extra special pleasure to be introducing Fran this evening, as she and I met for the first time close to 30 years ago in the archives of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an organization that actually plays a significant role in the novel Mazaltob. I was working on my dissertation. Fran was doing research on the female teachers of the Alliance, and so this for me feels like a very full circle moment. Our second speaker is Dr. Yaëlle Azagury, a writer, teacher, literary scholar, and critic. She has taught literature and humanities at Columbia University, as well as French and English literatures at Barnard College and SUNY Purchase. She contributed essays and scholarly articles for Women Writing Africa, published in 2008, Rethinking Jewish Culture and Society in North Africa and the Middle East, published in 2011, and other works. Her cultural criticism has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Jerusalem Report, and Lilith. A native of Tangier, Morocco, she holds degrees from the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle Sciences Po Paris, as well as a PhD in French literature from Columbia University. She is working on a new book about 4 North African Jewish women writers from the early 20th century. And together, Fran and Yaëlle are also writing an entry on Blanche Bendahan, the author of today's work, for JWA's Encyclopedia of Jewish Women. So stay tuned for that sometime in the next year. Okay, so we're going to jump in. This talk is a little bit different from most of our other book talks, in which usually we're talking to authors about their recently published books that they wrote. In this case, Fran and Yaëlle are editors and translators of a book that was first published in French almost a century ago in 1930. So that gives us extra layers to discuss. We'll talk about the identity of the author, the contexts in which the book was written and in which it's set, the process of editing and translating, as well as, of course, about the novel itself. So we are going to start with Yaëlle and Fran reading some short excerpts from the book, and then we will jump into our discussion. Yaëlle, do you want to start with the passage you selected to read, and then we'll switch over to Fran?
Yes, I will start because it's a sort of at the beginning of the novel, and it kind of gives you an idea of the overall topic, and also everything, what Fran will read after will make sense after this passage that I just read, which is a very crucial moment. It's the actual wedding ceremony of Mazaltob, and Mazaltob is this young 16-year-old girl from Tetuan who's marrying a man that she doesn't love, named Jose Khalfon. So if you have the book, it's on page 32, and it's a very significant passage, and very beautiful, and gives us an overall idea of Bendahan's style and overall subject of the novel. So it's top of 32 and I will begin. On the path of the wedding procession, all the porches have been whitewashed a few days ago. Sumptuously dressed in the local Berberisca costume, a solemn crown called sfifa around her head, rouge on her cheeks, and henna on her nails. She keeps her eyes closed all the way, she being Mazaltob, so that her husband is the first man she will see upon arrival. Family and friends have preceded her. The piyut Yalatchen rises to the now mostly darkened sky. The entire neighborhood is watching at their windows and doorsteps. You. That's a ululation of joy in Tetuan, used both by Muslims and Jews. So you. The flower of all flowers has left her home. With the Nahora, a huge lantern illuminating its path, the procession courses through the tiny streets of the Juderia. You. The father bestows on the most prominent man the honor of carefully guiding the blind steps of his daughter. And Mazaltob, with eyes shut, is led to her destiny. So that's the end of the passage.
Thank you. Fran, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in the novel, and you're going to read a little bit about the burial of Mazaltob's mother, right?
Yeah, actually, it'll be the epitaph on her grave. And then
amazing passage.
and then I'll read just a few excerpts from Mazaltov's inner thinking about who she is. So, but I just wanted to say first that when you and I met in the archives of the Alliance in 1995 was probably exactly the year that I first encountered Mazaltob and made a photocopy. So
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
It's a full circle in many respects. So this first quote really gives a sense of Bendahan herself, and the incredible thread of feminism that runs throughout the novel. So the epitaphs on the graves, both in Spanish and Hebrew, all look the same: name, date of death, and a few words of praise on the deceased life. Like elsewhere, it is enough in Tetuan to die to be regarded as virtuous. Nevertheless, Mazaltov's mother, like countless women of other races, deserves the following inscription on her grave. She spent her entire childhood working, helping her mother to raise her numerous family. Married off at a young age, she kept working, although she did it for herself. Between her 15th and her 38th year, she kneaded more than 10,000 kilos of bread. She prepared more than 8,000 lunches and dinners, spent 17,000 hours making preserves and preparing traditional alcaleo fried meat kept in oil. Additionally, she devoted more than 17,000 hours to cleaning the house and another 17 to sewing linens and clothing for her family. Up early, late to bed, she knew nothing of distractions, not even the most elementary walk. And throughout all those years, when she ceaselessly toiled and toiled, she sacrificed her youth and her beauty to that minotaur called home. May she now rest in peace. The second quote is rare in the novel. It's when we hear Mazaltov speaking to herself, although perhaps interrupted at times by Bendahan. And I've skipped things, and I'm just using a few sentences from a couple of passages so that we get a sense of what Mazaltov herself is going through. Why have I scorned happiness? Wonders Mazaltov ever so often. Who would have wept if I had listened to my heart and had become the wife of my childhood companion? My mother is dead. In my father's life, rife with the screams of my stepmother, there is little room for me. Preciada, her children, her husband, and her household, all are a buffer between us. Uncle Solomon, my aunts, my cousins, they are old. Alas, no one requires that vain sacrifice of me. And you, Jean, who hauls your moribund life across the ocean, Jean, will you ever forgive me, my light? It's because of me his life is shattered, because of me. And Mazaltov curses herself. Why did she banish Jean? Why did she fight her desire to see him again? What fallacious grasp of the word duty gave her the right to make someone suffer? Nevertheless, you did the right thing, approves the sectarian god of her childhood. Jean does not believe in me. No, you have sinned, counters the other god, the god of logic, who loves all his children equally, be they Christian, Jewish, or simply deistic, that god who loves even the atheist.
Thank you. So those passages give us a quick introduction to some of the big themes of the novel, with clearly issues around women's roles, tradition, agency. For the people who, I'm sure there are people in the audience today who haven't read the novel yet. So I'm going to give like a 40-second summary that will just give a little bit of the scaffolding around what the pieces that you both just read, and then we'll turn to talking about the book itself. So Mazel Tov is a beautiful, the novel tells the story of a beautiful young girl who seems to have a very bright future. Of course, her name, as we know, literally means good fortune. But her life is in fact tragic. She's trapped between competing cultures and unable to break out from the stifling weight of tradition to achieve her own happiness. So she grows up in a very traditional Sephardi community in Tetuan, Morocco. Virtually as a child, she's literally never left the Jewish quarter. But she is educated at the school run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, where she learns French and is exposed to French culture and Western culture in general. The passage that Yaëlle read is when at 16, she's married off to this 40-year-old man who has returned home from Tetuan from Argentina, where he's made his fortune and he's come back to find a wife. He marries this beautiful girl, thinks he's, kind of really won the lottery, and then doesn't understand her at all, and ends up abandoning her to return to kind of his dissolute life in Argentina. And she soon realizes that she's in love with her childhood friend, Jean, about whom she's speaking in the last passage that Fran wrote, who Jean had one Ashkenazi Jewish parent and one Christian parent, so he's a little bit on the outside here. And he is also in love with her. After many years of pushing him away because even though she's been abandoned by her husband, she feels that Tetuani women they traditionally do not remarry. Even if they're widowed or abandoned. She finally caves. She plans to run away with him, but he kisses her passionately. She kind of panics just as they're about to leave, and she returns home. And essentially, they both kind of die of sadness shortly thereafter. So I would love to, before we really turn to kind of dissecting some of these big themes, to see if have one of or both of you tell us a little bit more about the novelist, the writer, who was a fairly well-known writer in France in the middle decades of the 20th century, apparently. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about her own fairly complicated identity and background and life story, and perhaps why you think she and her novel then were largely forgotten in the decades after her death, which wasn't that long ago. It was in 1975. So I throw that open to either one of you.
And you want to start, and then
Yeah, I'll start, and then at some point I'll yeah. So Blanche Bendahan was born in Oran, Algeria in 1893, and like the protagonist in the novel, she had one Jewish parent and one Catholic parent. Her mother was an unwed young 19-year-old from Malaga, Spain, who died in childbirth. And Bendahan was adopted when she was 3 months old by Hayo Benoliel, who no doubt was her father, biological father. And what we don't know is whether she was converted to Judaism or not. And in fact, none of the articles interviewing her that we've read ever mentioned that she had one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent. And she doesn't mention it, as far as I can tell, in any of the articles that she wrote. But she certainly deals with it in the novel, with Jean sort of as her counterpart. Her father, we're not sure what, he probably was a colonial goods merchant, exactly like her husband to be. In any event, they traveled in France for the first 14 years of her life, living in many cities in France. And when she was 3 years old, he married who might have been her teacher at the time, Marie Hortense Genoux, a Catholic woman to whom Bendahan dedicates the novel, her Jewish novel, she says, and this stepmother guiding her so gently through the early years of her life. At the age of 14, Bendahan came back to Oran with her father. By then, he had divorced his wife. I think he had one more subsequently. And Bendahan, by the time she was in her early 20s, had made a name for herself already as a poet, a writer, a journalist, and at the age of 26, married Yaëlle Bendahan, who also was a colonial goods merchant. And Bendahan, as well as Yaëlle Bendahan, as well as Blanche's own father, were Tetuani Jews living in Oran. The community of Tetuani Jews in Iran was a very important community, a very proud community, and with explicit ties to Tetuan, to the culture, and also often leaving Iran for visits to Tetuan. So in both instances, she is connected to Tetuan, albeit born in Oran, Algeria. And she marries at the age of 26 and goes on to have an extraordinary career as poet, journalist, radio broadcaster, professor, and wins many awards. Yaëlle can speak to the poetry and the awards she won for her poems. And the Mazaltob was awarded the prize by the Académie Française in 1931, a year after it appeared. She was the only Jewish woman to be awarded such a prize that year, and the only one writing about a Jewish subject. So maybe I'll leave off there, Yael, and you'll pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I you know, as far as her life is concerned, I don't have much to add. But as far as her identity, certainly there's a little more to say. She is born in Oran, and Oran is in Algeria. I see somebody asked that question. And so she is, and of course, Algeria is a French colony. So she is schooled in the French Republican school, French system. All her references, all her readings, everything is very much full of French references and the classics, Balzac, Victor Hugo, Lamartine, and these references appear in Mazaltob. And at the same time, the oddity of this Oranese community, as Fran explained, is that many of these Jews came from Tetuan, and Tetuan themselves, the Jews from Tetuan were steeped in their Hispanic, a Sephardi culture, spoke a language called Jaquetia, which has some similarities to Ladino, but is not exactly the same. It's a mix of Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew, and Old Spanish, and lived with references and with memories of Sephardi life in Iberia, in Spain, and that golden age of Sephardi, of Spanish Jewry. So she's really steeped in these traditions, and that's what makes the specificity of her novel, is that it moves between different layers: the French, the Spanish, the Judeo-Spanish, some references to the Arabic, although that's perhaps more discreet. That's what constitutes who she is. And she's constantly sort of shifting identities and gears. And so she, for instance, in a very strikingly manner, she writes this novel, which is very much partly an ethnographic novel about the Jews of Tetuan and their customs and rituals and traditions. As I read, the marriage ceremony, and so and the language is very present. Judeo-Spanish, Jaquetia is very present. But at the same time, in 1948, she publishes this book of poems called, facetiously called, Poems en short, poems in short, but of course it means, it's a pun, wearing shorts. So a sort of irreverent book of poetry that has nothing to do with Tetuan or with her Jewish identity. So she's constantly in between those two levels, and that's what makes her such an interesting figure.
Yael, can I just add one thing about
Yeah.
the poem in short? I came recently across a wonderful quote from those poems, which certainly speaks to where she stands. The more I know men, the more I like my dog. So the humor of Bendahan comes through, also the feminism comes through, and she won a prize from the humor prize for that book of poetry.
Yes, an important prize, actually.
Very,
perhaps even more important than the
Academy.
the
She was
Académie
the only
Française.
woman. She was the first woman, I think, to win that prize since it had been established. Yeah.
So she was clearly a well-respected, well-known, talented writer. Um, Fran, you hinted at this. You said that you first came across her in about 1995 in the Alliance. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, but kind of about how the two of you came to kind of, for lack of a better word, rediscover Mazaltob and then decide to embark on this translating and editing project, and how you managed to do that together.
I'll begin because it sort of began with my initiative of contacting Yaëlle, and then she'll take over and explain who she is vis-a-vis this writer and other writers. So it began in the Alliance, the year you and I met, and I came across this novel, and the title intrigued me, and I flipped through its pages, and I realized that it took place in 1900 Tetuan. And probably there's no one right now alive who knows more about 1900 Tetuan than I, because the women teachers I was working on were born in Tetuan, taught in Tetuan, and I had read thousands of letters, all of which were dated around 1900, 1901 Tetuan. So I thought to myself, this is something I really want to read carefully. And in those days you could, so I made a photocopy of it and brought it home. Fast forward, and it's COVID. And I can't get into my office at the Wellesley Library because I'm not teaching anymore. And only if you're teaching can you be on campus. So I realized I had Mazaltob in my closet, and I had done nothing with it. So I took it out and read it carefully, and was so excited by it, but also knew that in order to translate it and do it justice, I would need a partner. And so I asked a friend who teaches at BC if she knew anyone who might be able to partner with me in this. And she gave me the name of someone, Ronnie Scharfman, who suggested that she couldn't do it, but I contact Yaëlle. And the likelihood that I would encounter someone who had the novel herself, who was from North Africa, who was working on North African women writers and who lived in Stamford, Connecticut, was so impossible to imagine. And that I contacted Yaëlle. I said to her, this is what I had in mind, a translation and then writing an introduction and whatever to help the reader. And she was on board immediately. And we didn't meet for almost a year. We did it by phone. And so now I'll let Yaëlle talk about why she had I still don't own the novel. I only have a photocopy.
I'll show you because it is interesting. It's all like protected in my little, but this is a 1930 edition, so it looks a little beat up. But so my story is, it's interesting. Yes, it was such a fortunate encounter. My mother so I was born in Tangier, Morocco, and my mother had a copy of Mazaltob, and it was lying on our bookshelves, but and she told me once, oh, you should read it. But of course, I wasn't interested in what's so close to me, so I never paid attention to it. And then when one of my professors at Harvard she's Middle Eastern, Susan Miller, she's a Middle Eastern studies professor, and she used it in one of her articles. And then she said, well, you should really read it. So that sort of sparked my interest. Of course, when somebody else, from an outsider tells you to read something that isn't your own culture. And I read it. And at that point, I was intrigued by it, but I didn't really know what to make of it. And then probably 10 years later or something like that, I started having this idea on a book about 4 women writers from North Africa. And of course, Bendahan came to mind, and I was just starting to work on it myself and to do the research when Fran got in touch with me, and it seemed like a miraculous encounter.
Yeah, what wonderful serendipity.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I love the thought of this all also happening at the beginning of the pandemic when we were desperate for connection and stimulation.
And we didn't even do it on Zoom. We talked on the phone, which was really incredible. We felt that Zoom was almost almost too distracting. So
we never did Zoom. In fact, we didn't know what we looked like. We didn't know what each other looked like until we met in person. Really traditional.
So this is a novel that is filled with really stark dichotomies. It's, male and female, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, Christian and Jew, tradition and modernity, a little bit Jews and Arabs, less so, but, sort of France versus this traditional Jewish Morocco. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of these dichotomies and the way in which it seems that Bendahan herself is kind of grappling with both the promises, but also the dangers of boundary crossing, because there's so many different ways in which these boundaries are enforced, crossed, crossed and then going back. And I think that I'd just love to hear you explore that a little bit for our audience.
Well, Fran, you want me to go on this one? Sorry. Okay, so the interesting thing is about Bendahan is that she is, as I was trying to sort of explain in my presentation of her, is that really she's part of two different cultures. She is an insider and an outsider of her culture. An insider because she knows and she documents very well the customs, traditions, rituals, language of her community, or actually, I shouldn't say it's her community directly. It's her father's community. She probably visited Tetuan and knows about this little this small community and the Hispanic Jews, but she probably wasn't completely part of it. And at the same time, so she is in it, but at the same time, she's trained very much in the French way and in the French school, and that French schooling gives her a particular vision of the Jews that she's studying. Sometimes it's a bit contemptuous or caricatured, or in what Edward Said would say, Orientalist. She's, those are her points of references and how she apprehends or she looks at this foreign culture. But at the same time, what makes it so powerful and interesting is that she's always in and out. And she really is trying to bring this culture of hers to this audience, mostly Christian, as Fran pointed out, that this is dedicated to her Christian stepmother. And she's really looking for, I would say, an assimilationist paradigm, a way of including her Jewishness and her Frenchness all in one in one package, that's what where this binaries that you point out and that you note come from, that they sort of suffuse the novel, black and white, blackness. Her sister is pictured as very as this bright black character, not black, but with very black hair and sort of black person looking. And Mazaltob, by contrast, is presented as exaggeratedly white. So it can seem a little irksome to our contemporary readers, but at the same time, she's never fully in one identity. She's constantly navigating both. And that's what I think and what Fran and I found so fascinating.
Can I just add a little bit to that, which is she navigates it, but she also undermines because she's allergic to binaries. She's allergic to one thing being good and another being bad, or one thing being black and another thing being white. So the minute she sets it out, she undermines it and critiques it. Whether it's critiquing what's going on in the West in contrast to the traditions of Tetuan, with the Alliance, which she clearly appreciates and lauds both its mandate as well as its accomplishments in educating women. She plays against it as well, by saying, well, it gave Mazaltob a nostalgia for a place she would never know. And of course, that was critiquing precisely what the Alliance was doing. And that critique of the Alliance, and the Alliance, I think, is a character who appears in the novel throughout, is repeated over and over again, as we see in the novel, because she is uncomfortable embracing anything fully without critiquing it somehow.
And I mean, I know this will seem a little bit far-fetched, but Fran and I were in a book group. We're just reading Jenny Erpenbeck, Kairos, this Booker Prize novel. And interestingly, what Erpenbeck does with dichotomies of East Germany and West Germany reminded me of what Bendahan is doing with the same, I mean, not the same dichotomy, but North and South.
Fran, we had a question in the chat just about a little bit more about the Alliance and what it did. And I think you are the right person to answer that question.
Right. Okay. So the Alliance was founded in 1860 in Paris by 6 young, highly educated French Jews. And it was a call to the Jews of the world, literally, to unite and to come to the aid of their co-religionists who were discriminated against in one way or another. And so one of the mandates of the Alliance was through diplomacy, to protect Jews who were being persecuted, primarily in Europe. But the other mandate was to establish a network of schools in North Africa and the Middle East to educate the young Jewish boys and girls living there. And in this, the Alliance had an image of regenerating the Jews living there, just as they, a century earlier, had been regenerated once they were emancipated and became French citizens. So it was, in their mind, a continuation of Jewish enlightenment, the Haskalah, a continuation of the deal that was made in emancipating them, that they would become good Frenchmen, and extending that to Jews in North Africa and the Middle East. And they were highly successful. They had about 183 schools by the time of the First World War, stretching from Tetuan in Morocco, which was their first school, to Tehran in Iran. There were about 30,000 members and about 45,000 students in these schools at the time of the First World War. There was even a committee in Keokuk, Iowa, an Alliance committee in Keokuk, Iowa. And the schools were modeled after the primary schools in France. And interestingly, the teachers were young girls and boys at the age of 14 who were chosen to be the brightest in their classes. They were sent by the Alliance to Paris for 4 years, where they were educated in a normal school. They took the exams that the teachers in France had to take in order to qualify as teachers. And then they were sent back to North Africa and the Middle East to teach in these schools that had been set up by the Alliance, rarely to be sent to their place of birth, almost always somewhere else. So the Alliance had as its mission, and you get this very much in Mazaltob as well, to ultimately educate the Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East to become good citizens of the countries in which they lived. What's missing in this novel, never mentioned, not a whisper, is Zionism. It's 1930, well, it was written in 1930. It takes place in 1900, but even so, there is no mention of it, although the doctor in the novel is modeled after a real doctor in Tetuan at the time, who had come to Tetuan on his way to Palestine because he was a fervent East European Zionist. But there is no Zionism in this novel, and the Alliance was at the time basically an anti-Zionist movement because its message and its mandate was really the model of emancipation that had taken place in Europe.
And in France specifically.
Yes, well, in France and then subsequently
Yeah.
the other countries.
Oh,
Whoop,
we can't hear you, Jenny.
Sorry, I muted myself because my dog was barking. Thanks, Fran, for that very helpful context. And that kind of brings me to my next question. Yaëlle, you said that Bendahan was really searching for sort of an assimilationist model, bridging these multiple cultures that she was influenced by. But of course, the sort of the tragedy of the novel is that Mazaltob herself clearly is not able to find that that model, and it. So I wonder if you think, in a way, Mazaltob, the character, would have been better off without this exposure to French culture and education, without her education at the Alliance school, without her education, her relationship with Madame Gérard, the French consul's wife, who gives her music lessons. Would she have been happier because she is then pulled between these cultures where she can't find a place?
Well, I mean, I would answer very simply, ignorance is bliss, but at the same time, I think it makes for a much more interesting and rich character. I mean, she is, again, we're in the same theme of shunning facile binaries. I mean, she's not one or the other, she's both and in and out, and neither one nor the other culture. So I think that's a modernist paradigm as well, and it makes for a very interesting moment both in history and in literature. Mazaltob is a tragic figure. She's, and she wants to escape, but she can't. She's strapped, and at the same time, she's not simply imprisoned. There's a love for that culture that she cherishes. She sees herself as a woman from Tétouan, a woman of Tétouan, and she characterizes herself as such. And she speaks of an atavistic almost gene of being a woman from Tétouan. And that word atavistic is so much of the time. We certainly would never use that nowadays, but that's where she is. Would she have been better off? Sure, but I think she opened up the door for a generation of other women, and that's why it's such a, it's also a feminist novel, to cross those boundaries and to go somewhere else.
Right.
Which is what I think is interesting. There's a generation of women writers that come after her that do precisely that. They're some of them have left, have gone to France, and still the memory of that origin holds them back. And I think that's a big difference with Ashkenazi culture. Fascinatingly, I don't think that American Jews ever think of going back to Poland, or there's no nostalgia in the same way as there is in Mazaltob and in other writers such as Jacqueline Kahanov, who's Egyptian, or Shoshana Bukobza, who's Tunisian, or Paula Jacques, who's also Egyptian. That's, I think, a very big difference between the two, between Ashkenazi and Sephardim.
Right. The concept of home feels very different.
And yeah, I think also Bendahan is in agony because she, I think personally, so cherished her Sephardi heritage and the Tetuani background, and is struggling with how to bring that with her into the modern world, which she has obviously embraced fully. And the struggle of between Jean and Mazaltob is precisely that. Can you do that? Can she move from Tetuan to the modern world, bringing with her what she cherished about Tetuan? And
I mean, you've touched on this already, both of you, but the portrayal of the Jewish community in Tetuan is so complicated, because clearly there is so much that she is criticizing about it as sort of narrow-minded and patriarchal, and clearly the women are all oppressed, but at the same time there's a warmth there, and yeah, Elle, could you just say a little bit more about sort of what you think she really does admire about the Tetuani Jewish community?
Well, I will sort of almost think about it through my own lenses, because this is also, I mean, I'm not from Tetuan, but I'm from Tangier, and it's still very similar. It's the same thing. Perhaps Tetuan was seen as more conservative than Tangier, Tangier being the more free-willing and open-minded. But still, there's an attachment to a culture that has its own very rich customs, traditions, liturgy, poetry or religious poetry. The mention in the passage that I was reading on the wedding about the piyut, Yalatren, the piyut are synagogue songs in the Sephardi tradition. They're very beautiful. There's also clearly a deep attachment to the romances, the Judeo-Spanish romances, which is there. These are really treasures of culture. I was sort of put to sleep to these lullabies, but not only for, I cherish them not only for that reason, but because they're really sort of have preserved a Spanish of the Renaissance and medieval times, and later on, and the beginning of the 20th century, the Spaniards themselves have rediscovered them and found them extremely precious and valuable for all the tales they tell about their Reconquista, but humorous tales, love stories. So I think that heritage is worth preserving and is worth sort of bringing to a wider audience. And interestingly, the other last thing that I will add is that the 1920s in France is a time of rediscovery of Jews and Jewishness, or I wouldn't say rediscovery, discovery. So there's in 1926, a French Jew called Armand Lunel, who publishes a book about Jews from the Comtat Venaissin, the traditions, their peculiarities. So and other authors throughout that decade are very much interested in Jewishness and what it means and the traditions. It's a decade that where really Jewishness is in fashion. So Bendahan is really bringing that and to the attention of this wider audience before we veer into this wildly and terribly anti-Semitic 1930s. I would say that 1920s is interested in Jews.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing as well, which is that what Bendahan does in describing Tetuan and discussing Tetuan is she also makes it a stand-in for Oran in Algeria, where she is living. And so there's some of the issues in the novel which don't belong in Tetuan, where, for example, there are no Christians living in Tetuan, and there are many Christians living in Oran, Algeria. And so that she is processing a lot of issues, some of which she takes to Tetuan 1900 Tetuan, which don't belong there, but they belong in her heart as issues that she's struggling with. But you're muted, Jenny.
I'm sorry, you'd think after years of Zoom, I would have figured that one out. It's a reminder of how, how novels reflect their time and place in which they were written as much, if not more, than the time and place that they are written about. I'd love, as we sort of start to wrap up, to hear a little bit about the process of translating this work, which seems like it must have been particularly complex. I mean, translation is always complex, but this is a novel written in French about a multilingual community, which Yaëlle was just pointing at, a community whose primary language was Ladino, which is itself a combination of languages, but it's also, there's French, there's Spanish, there's Arabic. And what was that like to work on, and how did you approach that?
Want me to start off a little bit and then
Sure.
hand it to you? So one thing we did not do was to sit down and decide what was how were we going to translate this? What would be the process? I think you would agree, Yaëlle, it was more an organic process. It developed as we went along. We had no theory of translation that we were superimposing upon our project. We emerged with a way of doing it by doing it. And we, as we said, we put the phones down and we were talking to each other by phone, and we did sentence by sentence. We had a number of iterations of the whole novel until we felt it did justice to the original.
The other thing that I think was on our minds, and that's where the difficulty resided, I would say, is that Bendahan really juggles two different registers. There's high and low, there's poetic and there's informal. And so trying to find when to use a more poetic translation and when to use the more informal was really important, because if we had done it all in poetic, it wouldn't have worked. And if we had done it all in informal, it would have been a disaster too. And I think this is why Mazaltob is a modernist novel, is that it's really mixing high and low register. It's doing something new. And doing something new in literature means that you have, when you translate it, it has to be transposed. And it's not such an easy job as it would appear.
So someone asked a question in the chat, which I think gets very much at some of these choices that you had to make. She asked, how did you choose Preciada, which is the name used for her for Mazaltob's sister, for Précieuse, which I think is the
Right.
name that was used in the original.
Right. It's a perfect
so we talk about that in the note on translation. It's a very interesting thing, because in the novel, in the original in French, the name is Précieuse, but Précieuse, as we explained, is a translation of the Spanish Preciada. That's a very Judeo-Spanish name. So to translate, basically what was really ironic is that our translation became a restoration of the original. So it's a translation of the translation.
Right. It's a reflection of the multi-layeredness of language in this community. As my last question, I'm going to ask a question that came up in the chat, which I think is a good way to go out, which is, how does an American woman of 2024 relate to this book written in the 1930s?
Mm-hmm.
Fran, go ahead first, and then I'll kick it over.
Whoa. I think that I think one way of relating, of course, is the feminism that is pervasive. And it's specific, yes, to issues in Tetuan in 1900, but it's also universal. And over again, as she plays with what is going on in Mazaltob's life, you can think about issues that we're still feeling and experiencing today. But then what I thought is, think about what's going on in Afghanistan, where young girls are yearning for education. If we look around the world today at the situation of young women, it's not dated. So I think that if we get out of our position of living in America right now and we think globally, this novel speaks to today.
Yeah, I would say, I would just sum it up in following the formula. I would say that Tetuan is a condition as much as it is a space. It's very succinctly described in the novel. It's, but it's more about what it means to be in a confined community, such as Tetuan. But it's a universal condition, and that you can find anytime and at any moment in time. And for women, it's an interesting, point to explore, because I think in a way women always find themselves in this situation. And the other last little thing that I will say is, you ask why would we be interested in this in the 21st century? Well, it really kind of struck me, as I'm repeating again about this Kairos, this Jenny Erpenbeck, and I was wondering, wow, how can I be interested in East and West Germany? And it's also an impossible love story, the story of Kairos Erpenbeck, and with all these references, sort of almost relevant to German people only. But at the same time, that's the beauty of translation and of discovering a culture that's completely foreign and sort of alien.
Yeah, and I have to say that, foreign and alien as Tetuan in 1900 feels to us today. And, I wouldn't compare our lives to that of Mazaltob's mother. But Fran, when you read the epitaph on her gravestone, I think any mother of young children, that resonates. The thousands of lunches you've made, the number of diapers you've changed, the number of bedtimes you've done. So that rings true even for those of us in 21st century America.
Right. Good point. And needs to be appreciated by everyone.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for acquainting us with this fascinating author and novel. I hope many people in the audience will be inspired to read it and to learn more about the Jewish communities in Morocco. As always, there's more to learn at JWA. We'll put in the chat links to some of the material that we have on our website. About Morocco, including and also as well Fran's entry in the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women on the teachers of the Alliance Israelite. A reminder to everyone, please fill out the virtual program survey so that you can let us know what you'd like to learn about in the future. And also a reminder, if you can, to donate before the end of our fiscal year, if you're able. This is the last of our spring 2024 programming. We'll be on hiatus for the summer, but we look forward to seeing you again in September. So watch your emails in August for information about our first series of fall book talks. And I will say, if you're going from here on to watch the presidential debate, all I can really say is bon courage. So good night, everyone. And thank you very much for being with us, Fran and Yaëlle, and our all.
Well, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.